Barochem everyone, Apostolic Watchman here, back with another video. I know it's a bit late, but Happy New Year everybody. Very much happy with how the end of 2018 was for me and how this year has gotten started off. I had two answered prayers. At the end of last year, I prayed and asked that God would bring more people to the channel who are looking for the truth so I can help them grow. So I'm happy to say that I've gone from 13 subscribers to 54 in just the end of last month into the new year. And the second prayer that I had was that God would allow for my video about the blood moon to reach at least 1,000 views. And so I'm happy to say that it's, as of today, it's at 1.7K. So thank you to all the new subscribers. Thank you to everyone who watched the videos and share them. You're very much an answer to prayer. If you saw my last video about the U.S. withdrawal from Syria, I told you then that politics is something that I try to stay clear of because it's not what I wanted the focus of this channel to be. However, every now and then there are issues that come up that I feel the need to address. And so in this video, we're going to be talking about Obamacare because in December, a federal judge in Texas declared the Affordable Care Act unconstitutional. And so it's likely that this law is going to end up at the Supreme Court again. And so I wanted to present you in this video with some problems with the bill, as well as some reasons for why I think it's unconstitutional. Now, you're saying, I have this letter here from the United States Senate, Robert Casey Jr. And you're probably saying, why do you have this letter? Well, go back in time a bit here. If you remember, in 2017, Republicans were trying to get their health care bill passed in the Senate. Well, at the same time, I was trying to get my proposal for how to fix our health care system to Congress. And so, at the time, I was a registered Democrat. And so I did what anybody would do. And I reached out to my Democratic rep in the Senate, who here in Pennsylvania is Robert Casey Jr. And I was calling and calling and calling. Couldn't get through. Calling, couldn't get through. Eventually, after calling and calling, I don't know how many times, I was given email addresses for two of his staffers that I was told handle email healthcare issues for him. And so I went from calling and calling and calling to then emailing and emailing and emailing. And I figured, you know, that they probably get bombarded with countless numbers of emails and phone calls and letters from people trying to voice their concerns. And so to make sure that it didn't get buried in the email feed, you know, I was sending it in chains of like 10 emails for like a week straight and got no response whatsoever. And so after a while, I did eventually get this letter. And I want to read you an excerpt from this because it's going to set the tone for this video. As you can see, it's from Robert Casey Jr., United States Senate, dated August 23rd, 2017. And it reads, "Thank you for taking the time to contact me about the Affordable Care Act. I appreciate hearing from you about this issue. In 2010, Congress passed and President Obama signed into law the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act. I voted for this legislation and continue to support the law today. I support this law because I believe that it reflects our nation's commitment to ensuring access to health care for all Americans Since its passage, we have made significant strides in improving our healthcare system. 20 million individuals have obtained health insurance. Insurance companies are no longer able to discriminate against individuals with pre-existing conditions, women or older Americans, and senior citizens have saved more than $20 billion on the cost of prescription drugs. I respect the views of those who remain opposed to the Affordable Care Act and appreciate understanding how we can improve upon the current law. However, I fundamentally believe that we must build upon and expand the important progress that we have achieved. And so, in my opinion, this was nothing more than Senator Casey's and the rest of the Democratic Party's lame talking points about the Affordable Care Act. I mean, no disrespect to the people in government, but I'm not stupid. You haven't made significant strides, because I can do 50 million minus 20 million and tell that you have less than half the people signed up who needed health insurance. If you know, before they passed the Affordable Care Act, it was estimated that some 50 million people in America did not have health insurance. And yet, here we are now, all these years later, and they still have less than half the people signed up. Or at least they did at the time that I was sent this letter. And so, it's important that we talk about this because, as I said, it's been deemed unconstitutional by a federal judge in Texas. So it's likely now that it's going to end up at the Supreme Court. Meanwhile, in Congress, they have so many things that they could be dealing with, and yet I heard reports that House Speaker Nancy Pelosi wants to prioritize a piece of legislation called the Equality Act, which would amend the Civil Rights Act of 1964 to include sexual orientation and gender identity to the list of things that cannot be discriminated against. Now, not saying I'm one way or the other on this, but I mean, we have literally a whole bunch of other problems that are more important that we could be dealing with. You have an opioid crisis going on. You have immigration issues. You have a failing healthcare system under Obamacare. You've got the trade war with China. You got a civil war in Yemen, civil war in Syria. I mean, there's so many more important things that we could be prioritizing, and yet they want to do this, which I find surprising because all Democrats have said is, we'll fix Obamacare. Let's fix Obamacare. They take back the House now, and they still aren't committed to fixing Obamacare. Instead, they're prioritizing the Equality Act, which is what brings me to problem number one. The Affordable Care Act does not contain any exemptions for people who purchase insurance through the exchanges. Now, if you remember, the whole reason why they mandated people buy health insurance is because you had people in Congress like Senator Chris Murphy of Connecticut and Senator Debbie Stabenow of Michigan and others who have continued to perpetuate this myth that somehow by poor and sick people not having insurance and going to the hospital to get treated, and by young healthy people like me holding out on buying insurance, that we were the reason why it was expensive. And that's false. According to a November 2013 report in the Journal of the American Medical Association, roughly 90% of the rise in healthcare costs between 2000 and 2011, the years leading up to the Affordable Care Act, could be attributed to rises in prescription drug costs, medical devices, and hospital care. So it had nothing to do with poor and sick people. It had nothing to do with young, healthy people like myself holding out. Needless to say, they still mandated that people buy the insurance, yet within the bill itself, there are no exemptions for people who cave in and buy these insurance plans. And on top of that, there's no exemption for people who obtain healthcare plans through their employers. So let's say you start a new job in July, right? When you go to file for your taxes, you still got fined for not having insurance January, February, March, April, May, and June. And so you have this problem where you have these people that are wondering why this bill isn't working, and it's because people got put into a position where they said, okay, if I don't buy insurance, I'm going to get fined for not having insurance, and if I cave in and buy it, I'm still going to get fined for all the months I didn't have insurance, and I'm going to be stuck with an expensive healthcare plan that doesn't meet my needs. Because if you look at the numbers, insurance rates have just continued to go up, 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 up. And so you had people looking at that and going, it's a lose-lose situation. Now, thankfully, Republicans have since done away with that mandate, so it's not going to be an issue anymore. But until the time that they did do away with it, this was a big deal. And it's part of the reason for why this law did not work. Which then brings me to, whoops, it's getting away. Problem number 2. The Affordable Care Act requires people provide proof of a qualified health care plan in compliance with the Public Health Service Act, a bill that was passed in 1941 and contains no exemptions for people with other forms of health care coverage. And so, as I said earlier, we have so many other issues we could be dealing with, like the opioid crisis, and yet Dems in the Congress are not trying to prioritize healthcare. And honestly, you can say that they're part of the reason for why we have this opioid problem. Because guess what? When they passed the Affordable Care Act, they mandated that people provide proof of a qualified healthcare plan in compliance with the Public Health Service Act, yet they didn't do anything to address the Public Health Service Act's outdated definition of substance abuse. And on top of that, if you read the Public Health Service Act, it says roughly that it defines a qualified healthcare plan as being one with which a card is issued. Well, by that definition, that would cover medical, dental, and vision. Yet, they didn't want dental and vision. They wanted people to provide proof of medical insurance. So you had people out there who are getting partial benefits packages through their employers where they get dental and vision coverage, and yet, even though you're issued a card for those types of insurance, they still got fined anyway, even though they are technically in compliance with the law. And so that's a big problem. But as I said before, now that Republicans have since done away with the mandate, that's not really going to be an issue. However, they're making it seem like, those who remain supportive of this law, that they're trying to make it seem like now that Republicans have done away with this mandate, that it's going to kill the bill. Well, the bill was collapsing under its own stupid provisions anyway. So, I don't get why that is. But needless to say, that brings me to problem number 3. And this is the point where I'm going to start addressing things that I feel are unconstitutional in the Affordable Care Act. Problem number 3, The government has essentially made it a crime to be uninsured medically, punishable by fining, yet the accused's right to due process is being violated by circumventing their right to face their accusers in court. If you read the Affordable Care Act, it says that if anybody fails to provide proof of a qualified health care plan in compliance with the Public Health Service Act, that they have to pay a fine that's assessed in the form of a tax penalty. And so you basically are stuck not being able to legally fight or contest that fine in court, which is highly illegal. I mean, I'll use this as an example. Let's say you're driving through an area and you're not familiar with the area, and you don't realize that the stretch of road you're on has a sudden change in speed. And so an officer pulls you over for speeding, and you say, "Oh, well, I'm sorry, I didn't realize there was such a drastic change there. You know, I'm not familiar with the area." And he still gives you a hefty ticket anyway. Guess what? It's not the law that you just get stuck paying this ticket. You have the right to go into court and contest it. And so guess what? When you go into court, you could say, Your Honor, yeah, I'm guilty of speeding, but in my defense, I'm not from the area, and so I wasn't aware that there was such a drastic change in speed there. Had I been aware of that, I probably wouldn't have been speeding. And so while I do accept responsibility, I do feel, however, that, this ticket I got is pretty hefty in light of those circumstances. And guess what? If you're lucky, the judge will knock off a few dollars off your ticket. Now, how is it that we allow that type of thing to go on, but we're circumventing people's right to contest these fines under the Affordable Care Act? I mean, obviously, again, this goes back to the mandate. Now that Republicans have done away with the mandate, that's not going to be an issue for people anymore. But it is unconstitutional. Which brings me to problem number 4. By requiring people to tell if they have health insurance on their tax returns, they are violating people's right to not self-incriminate, as well as violating people's right to protection from unwanted searches and seizures. Now, I'm not sure if this is a state thing or if it's with all the exchanges, but if I'm not mistaken, if you go into the exchanges and try and sign up for health insurance, they have a disclaimer up on the Obamacare exchanges that by applying for health insurance through the exchange, you may be subjected to a name database search through other government agencies, including the Department of Homeland Security. Why are we making people subject themselves to a random database search through an agency like the Department of Homeland Security just to get health insurance? And so going back to my last point about being able to contest this stuff in court, I mean, can you imagine how much controversy there would be if somebody went to a courtroom and said, "Your Honor, the reason why I didn't buy health insurance was because when I was on the exchange, I saw that they had a disclaimer up saying that that by signing up for insurance, I may have my name run through random government databases, including DHS, and I don't think that that's right." And it would get thrown out. But that is an issue. Which brings me to problem number 5. Now this one is a serious problem because by allowing states to approve insurance rates with which tax money is being used to offset the cost, the Affordable Care Act is violating the constitutional requirement that all tax money be appropriated by Congress. So, For those of you who are not familiar with how our system of government works, anytime the government wants to spend your money that you pay in taxes, they have to draft a formal spending bill and sign off on it. So let's say, for example, the government wants to put $3 billion into the military budget. It's not just, they just take the money and put it in there. They have to draft a spending bill that says we're going to put $3 billion into the military budget, and then they have to vote on it. And what's been going on with the Affordable Care Act is the states are the ones approving the insurance rates, but it's the government that's sending tax money in unspecified amounts to offset the cost. And honestly, we could have had this bill fixed a long time ago if people in Congress pushed back and said, look, we're not going to keep putting out tax money to cover these healthcare costs if insurance companies are just going to keep raising the rates. And yet they didn't do that. And so now here we are now. We have these overpriced health insurance plans that nobody wants, and yet Democrats are not committed to fixing our healthcare system. Which brings me to my last point here. Point number 6. Yeah, I know it's cliche, but what can you say? If you're going to listen to me speak for 30 minutes, I got to keep you entertained somehow, right? Problem number 6. The Constitution prohibits the passing of ex post facto laws, and because of various provisions, the Affordable Care Act essentially functions as an ex post facto law. Now, some of you watching this, you may be saying, what is an ex post facto law? Well, the Constitution prohibits the government from passing ex post facto laws, which are laws that seek to do away with the rights and provisions granted under another bill without formally repealing it, or repealing the section with which they're desiring to change. This is why you heard Republicans saying we need to repeal and replace Obamacare. And so you had Democrats, they were hopping all over that big word repeal and making it seem like you have to do away with the whole law. No, you can do away with portions of the law, which is how Republicans were able to do away with the mandate in their tax bill. But needless to say, to understand this whole thing, you need to understand that the Founding Fathers were very much into the idea of balance in government and equal representation. That's why you only have 2 senators in each state. It's because they wanted to ensure that a small state like Connecticut or Rhode Island has just as much say in government as a big state like Texas or California. And so that's why you only have 2 senators per state. And so in playing off of that idea, they gave us a formal process for how we amend or change laws. And that is the repeal process. And so they wanted to ensure that if a law got passed that genuinely helped people, that those who opposed it couldn't simply just increase their numbers in Congress and rip it up. That's why we have this formal process. And so now that it's looking more likely that this law is going to end up at the Supreme Court again, I think the biggest question that needs to get answered is, where do the rights of the government start or end, and my rights as a citizen begin with regard to having discretion over my health care? That's a big question I think really needs to get answered in court, because if you're still in support of this. Okay, look, we can sit here and say the government has right to mandate people buy health insurance. Whatever. If they're going to do that, they cannot do it in such a way that that it hinders people from getting it. They shouldn't be able to say you can only sign up for insurance at the beginning and end of the year, and if you try and sign up outside of that window, that you have to meet requirements to get health insurance. And that goes double if they're going to be fining you, which is why I disagree with the Supreme Court decision that they have the right to fine on the basis of the government's right to tax. If they're going to fine people for not having health insurance, then they need to make sure that people can buy health insurance plans all year long with no hindrance whatsoever. And there is such a thing as consumer advocacy laws. So if they're going to mandate people buy insurance, then they need to do something reasonable to make sure that these plans are affordable and that they meet people's needs. We shouldn't be in this position that we're in, but we're in it anyway. And so, God willing, they'll deem this thing unconstitutional because there is such a thing as consumer advocacy laws. And, you're not obligated to support a service or business. You're not obligated to. That's why you've seen cell phone carriers shift to requiring contracts because, using this as an example, let's say you decide after having got your plan that 3 months later you decide, you know what, I think it's too expensive, or I don't really like the plan that I have, and you want to switch carriers. Well, guess what? The company that you're getting your cell phone from, they can't tell you that you can't switch. They can't do that. If you want to switch, you can switch. And so we really need to have this addressed in court. Where do the rights of the government end and my rights as a citizen begin with regard to having discretion over my health care from a consumer perspective? And so hopefully you've learned something in this video. Make sure to like and subscribe and to share this with others. And in 2019, I want to do something a little bit different. And so while I'm still encouraging that you leave comments, I'm also asking that if you're a subscriber and you have a question you'd like to see answered in a video, that you pose your question in the comments section. Thanks again to everybody for watching. God bless.